Hi and welcome back to my channel. As you might be able to tell by the title of this video, in today's video we're going to be talking about audiobooks, and specifically this is going to be my love letter, my ode, my defense for the medium of audiobooks and why I think you should give it a shot if you've not tried it yet. Ever since I discovered audiobooks like 2 or 3 years ago, I've completely changed the way that I read. I live completely differently because I consume books in a different way, and it's just been great, and I wanted to share what I know, my knowledge and my passion for the subject with you. In the first part, I kind of want to explain why I think audiobooks are great and why I think a lot of the times it's been given a very bad rep. Secondly, I wanted to give you some recommendations as to what kind of books you should be starting off with, because there is a learning curve, and I think a lot of people, when they start off, they just pick very bad books to begin with. Lastly, I wanted to give you some recommendations for audiobook apps, the ones that I recommend, the ones that I don't really recommend, and hopefully get you started on your audiobook journey. So let's get into it. I personally think audiobooks get a bad rap a lot of the time because a lot of people think it is a very lazy way of reading. They don't think it is a proper way of reading, and it is just often considered like a worse reading experience. A lot of the time when I tell people that I love to read audiobooks, they're like, yeah, but that's not proper reading. Like, you're not reading an actual book. In my opinion, that's a very ableist way to look at reading, because for a lot of people, audiobooks are the only way that they can consume and can enjoy a piece of literature. Obviously, for people that are visually impaired, audiobooks are essential, but also if you have a neurological problem and you're not really able to focus on a piece of written text for very long, or even for neurodivergent people who have trouble with understanding emotion off of a written text, it can be very helpful to listen to an audiobook and hear the sarcasm, hear the witty banter that makes it a lot easier for people to understand. Saying that audiobooks are not a proper form of reading, you're kind of neglecting a very large group of people that can only use audiobooks to consume literature, and in my opinion that's a very ableist take on it. So I know I'm getting a bit emotional about this, but I just find that a very silly take. And sure, I can give it to the people when they say that physical books might take more effort than reading an audiobook, because you have to like sit down with it, open it, focus on the text. But also, to my defense for audiobooks, a lot of people tell me that they cannot get into audiobooks because their mind wanders and they're not able to focus on what is being said. But that is also because you're not used to it. You need to learn to listen to audiobooks. It is kind of a learning curve. So in that way, it is also kind of a skill. It can be, for a lot of people, even more difficult than reading a physical book. That kind of naturally brings me to the second part of this video, which is how can you get into audiobooks? What are some of the best books to start off with? How can you make sure that you do not immediately like wander off like a lot of people tell me? I highly recommend, when you start your audiobook journey, to pick up a book that you have already read, because as much as you would like to think, as much as we humans like to think that we are multitasking creatures, we are not. Contrary to like reading a physical book, with an audiobook, 9 times out of 10 you're going to be doing something else while listening. That's like one of the benefits of an audiobook. You can be getting ready for the morning, you can be driving your car, you can be commuting, you can be cleaning, you can be doing something else while listening to an audiobook. However, especially when you start off, it is, like I said, sort of a muscle that you have to train, and you're going to naturally wander off. If you pick an audiobook that you've already read, you know the storyline, you know the characters, you know the world, and it doesn't really matter as much if you wander off for a second or two, because you know what is happening, you know what is going on, so it's not going to interfere with your enjoyment of the story. Aside from like picking a book you've already read, I highly recommend going for a non-fiction book, especially a non-self-help non-fiction book. So nothing that is about like how to get money or how to manifest your dream life. Like, don't do that, because you need to focus for those types of books. Like, they're meant to teach you something, and if you're listening to it for the first time, you're not really going to absorb what is being said. That is why I recommend, for example, an autobiography, preferably even narrated by the author themselves, because it's kind of like listening to a radio show or to a podcast. It is an experience that we've all had before. We've all listened to the radio, we've all listened to a podcast before. So that is why a biography might be very helpful, or a non-self-help non-fiction book. So like a book on a topic that you find very interesting. I recently read Wordslut, for example, which is an audiobook that is about how sexism is kind of embedded in the English language. Very interesting, and it's also something that you don't really need to be taking notes on. Like you can obviously, but it's more of like when you're watching a documentary. Like it's interesting to learn about it, but you're not going to want to actively use that knowledge. It's sort of more going to be stored in the back of your mind, and you're not actually going to be using it in any way. A third recommendation is a rom-com, a straight up easy rom-com. Why, you may ask? Rom-coms typically follow a very straightforward narrative that you can kind of fill out on your own. What I mean by that is that contrary to like a fantasy where you have to like focus on the world building and you get a lot of information that you just, I wouldn't recommend picking up a fantasy for an audiobook because it requires a lot of brain work on your part, and especially if you're starting out, it's just not the best type of book to begin with. A rom-com, however, you kind of know how a rom-com is going to go. A lot of the times it's very tropey, so it's like an enemies to lovers, or you have like sunshine ex grumpy. Like they're very recognizable, which makes it a bit easier for you to like fill out the things that you might be missing. For example, the world, contrary to like a full-on fledged fantasy, the actual world of a rom-com is pretty straightforward. Like it's a small town or it's like a big city, like it's recognizable, so a lot easier to digest. Lastly, and this is a bit contradictory to what I said previously, but I highly recommend picking up a graphic audio fantasy audiobook. Why? Because these graphic audio audiobooks are described as like a film inside of your head.
A movie in your mind.
Which is basically what it is. Like these audiobooks have like a full cast, so every character has a different voice actor. A lot of the time there is like background music, background noises, which makes the entire experience incredibly immersive.
Then it appeared. I ran. It was a giant worm, or what might have once been a worm had its front end not become an enormous mouth filled with ring after ring of razor-sharp teeth. It barreled toward me, its pinkish-brown body surging and twisting with horrific ease. These trenches were its lair, and I was dinner.
You'll hear like sword fighting in the background where there's a sword fighting scene, or you'll hear like crackling fire if you're inside of a house and it's like an intimate scene. So it kind of sets the scene for you, which makes it a very accessible way of listening to an audiobook. I know they have a graphic audio production of the entire Court of Thorns and Roses series. They're currently working on Crescent City, and they're also doing Fourth Wing. If you want to get into audiobooks and love fantasy, I definitely highly recommend picking up a graphic audiobook. Now, what audiobook apps do I recommend? I highly recommend, if you're starting off with your audiobook journey, is to just check out Spotify. Spotify has a very large catalog of audiobooks, especially like classics are on Spotify, so it's a great way to get started with audiobooks without having to commit to a different app, because a lot of people have a Spotify subscription. So you can just check out if there is a book on Spotify that you find interesting. Secondly, I highly recommend Storytel or Everand. Everand was previously known as Scribed, but they're kind of very similar in the way that they function. They have a very large catalog of books, and every single month you pay a set fee. I think it's like between 10 and 15 euros, and you can basically access all of the audiobooks on the app. So basically it's like Spotify. You pay a set fee and you can listen to as many audiobooks as you want unlimitedly. There's also Libby. That's kind of an app that you can use when you have a library card. I'm from Belgium, so I don't have access to Libby, but if you're in the United States, I definitely would check out Libby because it gives you access to all of the audiobooks that are available in your local library. So you kind of rent an audiobook like you would rent a movie for a period of time. And then there's Librivox. They have a very large library of free audiobooks. The majority of the audiobooks on that app are narrated by volunteers that upload their audiobook onto the site, and you can access it free of charge. I think the majority of them are classics, but it's definitely a great way to get into audiobooks if you don't want to spend any money. I know that Audible is a very, very well-loved app for audiobooks, but I personally do not recommend it or don't use it. I'm probably never going to be sponsored by Audible when I say this, but like, it's not that I don't think Audible is a good audiobook app, but I think it's not for me, because what Audible does is that you have a subscription that you pay every single month, and you get a credit to purchase one book in their entire catalog. With that credit, you can buy an audiobook, and that audiobook is yours for basically the rest of your life. And I do have to say, Audible has a great catalog of books. They have pretty much every single new release as an audiobook. So if you want to get new releases immediately as an audiobook, I do recommend checking Audible out. The thing that I don't really like about it is because you only get 1 credit a month, you cannot really read as many audiobooks as you want to every month. I typically read at least like 3 or 4 audiobooks a month. So the system of Audible is just too limiting for me personally. But if you know you're not going to be listening to audiobooks as much, Audible is definitely a viable option. For me personally, I just prefer something like Storytel or Everand a bit more because I can like listen to audiobooks unlimitedly and don't really have to pay attention to how many credits I have. So yeah, that was kind of it. So hopefully this video kind of inspired you to get into audiobooks, and if you're already into audiobooks, I'd love to hear in the comments what your favorite audiobook is, and I'll talk to you later. Bye!